Habakkuk is my favorite of the minor prophets. I love the message of the book of Habakkuk. I'm fascinated by the structure of this book. In my opinion, this is just a flat-out amazing little 3-chapter book. The first half of Habakkuk is a conversation between God and the prophet Habakkuk, and the second half of Habakkuk is a pair of songs that were written in response to that conversation. So I think this is just a really cool book, and so we'll start off as we always do in this series by looking at the introductory material to Habakkuk, which is pretty brief. Habakkuk 1:1 says, "The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw." So this is another one of those minor prophets that we don't know much of anything about the prophet. Our best guess is that Habakkuk was a Levite, maybe a priest, due to the songs that he wrote. Habakkuk chapter 3 could easily slide right in as the 151st Psalm, and that makes people guess that maybe Habakkuk was one of those Levites who had the role of leading in worship in the temple as a musician. We can't be exact about the dating of Habakkuk, but I think we can get pretty close when we narrow it down to a couple of things based upon this book. The first thing we need to know about that we can narrow us in on the dating of Habakkuk is that Habakkuk had to have been written after the time period when the Babylonians or the Chaldeans would have been well known for their vicious and cruel treatment of others. Because there was a time period in Israel's history where Israel viewed the Babylonians or the Chaldeans as allies. And I'm not going to think of the king's name. Hezekiah actually made an alliance with the Babylonians that got him in a lot of trouble, but after he got healed. And so there was a time where the Babylonians had a good relationship with the Jews. But Habakkuk was written at a time period where as soon as Babylon gets mentioned, Habakkuk's like, whoa, not Babylon. Those people are cruel and vicious. So they did not gain that viewpoint by people in Judea until after the year 612 BC, and that's when Babylon wiped out Nineveh. So this book had to take place after the year 612 BC, and then it also had to begin before the Babylonians would attack Judah. So that means it would have had to begin written before the year 598 BC. So it had to take place between 598 and 612 and 598 BC. And then we can narrow it down a little bit better because it probably didn't take place between 612 and 609 BC. And the reason I say that is because Josiah was the king of Judah during those 3 years. And the one thing we know about Josiah is he was one of the good kings. He was godly. He led a lot of wonderful reforms. So that means that we can probably place Habakkuk, not probably, but I think it's pretty definite, we can place Habakkuk during the reign of Josiah's son, Jehoiakim. And this would put this book between the year 609 to 598 BC. So this is written targeting the kingship of Jehoiakim and the injustice of his reign, probably closer to the earlier part of his reign as well. And the one thing we're going to see really early on at the very beginning of Habakkuk is that what gets this book rolling is that Habakkuk is not a happy camper. Habakkuk is also, I think, the kind of prophet who wouldn't want me to tell you why he's not a happy camper. He would probably want to tell you himself. So we'll let Habakkuk, with his own words, tell you why he's angry instead of an upstart 39-year-old pastor from 2022. I don't need to be telling you his problems. He can do it all by himself. How long, O Lord, will I cry for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me, strife exists, and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored, and justice is never upheld, for the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. Now, Habakkuk has a rather simple complaint, but if you're the one making the complaint, while the complaint may be simple, it is heart-wrenching to endure. Habakkuk's complaint is that the nation of Judah has been consumed by injustice during the reign of Jehoiakim. That there is a government in Judah, there's a king ruling over the nation, but the government is not functioning in a way that will allow people to live basic, peaceful lives. Habakkuk describes the injustice of this time period as, and this is a lot of adjectives in one little 3-verse section, but he describes the injustice as violence, iniquity, wickedness, destruction, strife, and contention. That's a lot of stuff to cram in such a short period of time. And it appears that the main problem is this, and that is when injustice is occurring during the days of Jehoiakim. So let's say someone loots travelers as they're going from one city to another, or you have merchants who are deceiving buyers by making them think that they're going to get a healthy animal, but really that animal is sick and it's on its final days. Or someone thinks that they're going to get a specific measurement of grain that they're purchasing, but really the gauge was deceptive and they're not getting the amount of grain that they were thinking. All of these various types of wickedness are happening in a society. But during the reign of Jehoiakim in Judah, whenever someone presented that wickedness to the king would either do one of two things probably. One, he would probably say, I don't really care. That doesn't matter to me that that's happening. You're not that important to me. Or probably the other way that was happening is someone would complain about the actions of that person, and then the person who was committing the wickedness would go up to King Jehoiakim and say, here's a couple of coins, king, to just look the other way. And he would just deposit that money as a bribe and then look the other way. And so the issue that Habakkuk has is there's all this wickedness in the land, but the government, the king, is doing nothing. And what happens when a political leader fails to prosecute and imprison criminals? Well, criminals decide then that it is worth it, that it pays to prey on others and crime grows. When you defund the police in our modern terms, what you are doing is you are empowering the criminals and then you are creating new ones because you're incentivizing the justice. So what Habakkuk's complaint here is, I'm crying out for injustice, I'm crying out for violence, and no one's doing anything. And this is actually probably a pretty stinging rebuke because not only is Habakkuk saying, my political leaders aren't doing anything, but he's also saying, God, you aren't doing anything. And if we remember how the genealogy of Judah works, that this is a son of David on the throne, when Habakkuk says, Jehoiakim's not doing anything, he's ultimately saying, God, your king, your son of David, who you put on the throne, he isn't doing anything. So why are you allowing the innocent to be swallowed up in injustice? So it's a pretty simple complaint that Habakkuk has. My country, my nation, God, your nation is being swallowed up by injustice, and no one's doing anything about it. I wonder at this time in Habakkuk's life if he might have been meditating on Exodus chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, which went, so God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice on them. And Habakkuk is saying, you took notice on the slaves in Egypt. You heard their cry, and you delivered them. Well, we are crying too, and from my perspective, God, you don't hear. You're not taking notice. And so God responds now to that complaint in verses 5 and 11, and he tells Habakkuk how he will take notice. Look, so again, we want to make sure that we catch this right. Verses 2 through 4, complaint of Habakkuk. Verses 5 through 11 is the response of the Lord to that complaint. Look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people, who march throughout the earth to seize dwellings which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an evil eagle, swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like the sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. Then they sweep through like the wind and pass on. But they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. Now, there's no real other way to put God's response to Habakkuk, and God's response to Habakkuk is it's brutal. I remember when I was in high school, I had my first filling on my teeth right after I got my braces off. I got my braces off, ended up having a cavity because of one place the braces were that I couldn't brush, and I needed a filling there. And I went in for the first filling. The dentist gives me the shot for the Novocaine, which always stings, but then it's always supposed to have the good numbness of the Novocaine afterwards. I don't know if he was just in a big hurry that day, but he went almost immediately to working on that filling, and I'm there like gripping the seat because I'm like, there's no Novocaine working yet. And he's like, you look uncomfortable. And I'm like, yeah, I'm uncomfortable. I can feel everything. And then I remember he goes, well, we're almost done, so we're just going to finish. And then he goes through the rest of the filling. And then, of course, within probably 60 seconds of them being done, the Novocaine kicks in. And then I have that numbness and the bad feeling of that for the rest of the day. But man, that pain was sharp and it was awful. I got my tooth filled, but the process of getting my tooth filled that day was terrible. Well, that's kind of the dentist that God is going to be for Judah in this scenario. God's going to deal with the wickedness in Judah. God is going to remove Jehoiakim. The violent will be struck down. The problem is, the tool that God is going to use to strike down Jehoiakim is the Babylonians. It's the Chaldeans. So this is similar to a dentist saying, you're coming to me with tooth pain. All right, we're going to get rid of that bad tooth. We're going to heal it, but there's not going to be any Novocaine. We're just going to pull it out, we're going to take it, and we're going to deal with it. You're going to feel all the pain. And God provides here, Habakkuk, a very accurate description of how the Babylonians were under Nebuchadnezzar. It is shocking when you look at the actual chronological history of how quickly things went from the Assyrian Empire dominating to then the Babylonians taking over everything. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, he was swift, like horsemen chasing down someone who was running, going through state after country after country. I mean, it's just remarkable how the Jews, and I think one of the reasons why God says, you're not going to believe this as I told you, because for multiple generations, the Jews had had alliances with the Babylonians. One of the reasons that the godly King Josiah died is because he went to fight the Egyptians because he was aligned with Babylon. No one saw Babylon as a future enemy of Judah. So when God says, Babylon, who just wiped out the Assyrian Empire, they're coming for you next, that was like, whoa, I cannot believe they are going to come for me next. And if it happens, it's going to be the most terrible thing. And so God says, I see the wickedness, Habakkuk. I'm going to deal with Jehoiakim, but I'm going to do it through Babylon. And when he tells that to Habakkuk, Habakkuk's like, I'm not okay with this. This is not a good answer. And so just like Moses in the wilderness, we have another prophet who is arguing with God. So we have Habakkuk's second statement to God, his second argument in chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 1. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge. And you, O God, you, O Rock, have established them to correct. Your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things with a ruler over them? The Chaldeans bring them, all of them, up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net. Because through these their catch is large and their food is plentiful. Will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing? I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I am reproved. So Habakkuk argues that God's response to the injustice of Judah doesn't fit with God's character. Habakkuk's saying, God, you're holy. God, you're righteous. God, how could a holy and righteous God have someone who is more wicked, more unjust than Jehoiakim bring judgment on your own people? How could you have someone who is more abusive than the Jews in our own land bring judgment upon us? God, you are pure. God, you can't approve of evil. So how can you approve of Babylon being the instrument to judge Judah? So Habakkuk is just in a state of disbelief in verses 12 and 13, which God prophesied just a few verses earlier when he said, wonder, behold, you're not going to believe this I told you. He's saying, Habakkuk, you're not going to believe this. And Habakkuk just can't understand how this will happen. And then in verses 14 through 17, Habakkuk uses a fishing illustration to picture what it will be like when the Babylonians arrive on the land of Judah, which is basically how it's been when Babylon's gone to every other nation. And that is Babylon comes in like fishermen with nets who indiscriminately gather all the men who are like fish that they can trap in their nets. They pull them up with hooks. And the thing about the Babylonians coming in is they're not going to separate the good fish from the bad fish, the righteous fish from the unrighteous fish. They're just going to catch them all. And they're going to devour everyone. And then when it's all said and done, they're going to end up sacrificing to their own gods. They're going to sacrifice to their nets. They're going to sacrifice to their weapons at war. So Habakkuk's saying, God, who's going to receive all the glory when they do this? Their gods are going to receive all the glory. They're going to sacrifice to their gods, and they're going to forget about you. And so Habakkuk just can't understand how this will be. And interestingly enough, we know from the book of Jeremiah, though, that while Habakkuk can't see it himself, Jeremiah is going to create a way for the righteous to be spared from the worst of Nebuchadnezzar. We need to remember that when Nebuchadnezzar first shows up on the scene, what does Jeremiah go around the city of Jerusalem telling everyone to do? He says, surrender. If you surrender, if you hand yourself over to Nebuchadnezzar, he will peacefully, and this is what he did, he just peacefully took them all back to his homeland. They got free trips to Babylon. Not only did they do that, but we end up having people like Daniel and his friends who get put in places of high service in the empire of Babylon. So Habakkuk is saying, they're just going to catch us all up like fish and not care righteous and unrighteous enough. And the one thing Habakkuk doesn't know is that God has actually put a system in place for that not to happen if they will listen to Jeremiah and respond to his prophecies. And so Habakkuk, though, can't see this. He can't understand it. And two things I love about this is, one, he's like, I'm going to just stand here, God, and I'm going to wait for you to tell me, what your response is. I'm going to stand here like a guard, patrolling and waiting for you to come and speak to me because I know that you will. And then also I like how he ends that by saying, waiting for when I'm reproved. So Habakkuk's pretty sure that even though he's complaining, he knows that he can't see things right, and God's going to let him know how it will be right. And this is something that we need to be willing to do as well, because there's going to be times in our life where things that we're going through don't make sense to us. We can't understand them. And in those moments, we need to be like Habakkuk, and we need to just be willing to wait. And we need to be willing to be patient. How often in the history of God's people does God send his people off to just simply wait upon him? Moses waited in the wilderness for 40 years before he was called back to Egypt. David was anointed to be king over all Israel at least 10 years before he was crowned king of all Israel. And then we have those two beautiful characters who show up when Jesus is presented at the temple. I'm going to preach about it this year at Christmas, but Simeon and Anna, who are there when Jesus is presented at the temple, these people who just waited their whole life just to get a glimpse of the Christ child who was to come. God is comfortable having his people wait. God is comfortable having us be patient upon him to the point where again and again in the scriptures, the Bible tells us that it is a good thing for us to wait upon the Lord. When we wait upon the Lord, what does it actually do for those of us who are waiting upon God? It strengthens us. It empowers us when we wait upon God. And so we see Habakkuk here waiting upon God in chapter 2, verse 1. And so we don't know the gap between Habakkuk 2:1 and Habakkuk 2:2 when God came to answer him. I'm going to guess based on how this happens that it didn't take too long, but at least there's some period of gap of time we need to understand between chapter 2, verse 1 and chapter 2, verse 2, where Habakkuk is waiting upon the Lord. And then God comes back to him with a message that is for Habakkuk and then for Habakkuk to share in verses 2 through 5. Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it, for it will certainly come, it will not delay. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all people. I want to make a note again. I mentioned it quickly in passing at the beginning about the structure of this book and why I'm going to stop here this morning in our 2 weeks on Habakkuk. I don't think enough people emphasize the structure of Habakkuk when examining this book, and the chapter divisions of Habakkuk do us absolutely no favor in understanding how this book was laid out. So chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2, verse 5, which we're looking at this morning, the first half of Habakkuk is the back and forth conversation between God and Habakkuk. So Habakkuk comes and makes two complaints before God. The first complaint is there is injustice in Judah. The second complaint is Babylon is an unjust tool to punish the injustice in Judah. And then we have two responses for God. The first response to God is, I hear of the injustice in Judah, and I'm sending Babylon. And then the second response that God has is in verses 2 through 5, and we'll talk about what that is in just a moment. But the rest of the book of Habakkuk, after chapter 2, verse 5, is two songs that were written by Habakkuk in response of God's words in verses 2 through 5 of chapter 2. So the first song that Habakkuk will write in response to these words is a song of woe upon those who sin. So if you're going to engage in sin, if you're going to live in sin, Habakkuk is basically saying, woe upon you who trust in your sinful behavior. And then in chapter 3, he has a second song that says, basically blessing for those who trust and wait upon the Lord. And it ends in one of the greatest statements of trust in God in all of the Bible at the end of Habakkuk chapter 3. So I say that before I get to verses 2 through 5 to say that my understanding, my interpretation of how I understand verses 2 through 5 is based a lot on the songs that follow these verses that we will look at next week. So I think that the way that Habakkuk interprets these words is revealed in the songs that he wrote after this statement by God. So let's talk about what God said to Habakkuk when Habakkuk said, God, I can't understand why you would send the Babylonians. The first thing that God says to Habakkuk is, Habakkuk, these words, this section right here, this is not a private message for you. He wants Habakkuk to share these verses with as many people as possible. That's why the Lord says to Habakkuk, inscribe it on a table. He actually says to inscribe it with plain, big letters. So write it out plainly, write it out big. I think you should actually translate that verse as saying, write it so clear that someone who is running can read it. So the idea is, if someone's running past this tablet, they can make out what it says even while they're running down the road. So the idea is like a big billboard that we make huge with big letters so you can see it even when you're driving down the road. So Habakkuk says, maybe make the world's first billboard. And this is what I want you to inscribe on this tablet. And then God says, the reason you need to do this is because it will be fulfilled very soon. And we know it will be fulfilled very soon because we know Babylon's going to be there within less than 10 years. Babylon's going to be there super fast. Jehoiakim will not rule very long. So he's saying this is going to happen. And then this is the message on the tablet. The message is God is giving everybody that reads this 2 choices. You all have 2 choices for life. Choice number 1, you can be proud and arrogant against God. You can drink, you can get drunk, and you can waste your life away. But if you take that route, what will be the end of your pride and your drunkenness? It will end with a life of unsatisfaction. I don't really like the Rolling Stones, but the Rolling Stones does have one song that I actually really appreciate because I think the theology in the song is spot on, and that is, I can't get no satisfaction. No matter what you do, no matter how much you try and you try and you try, you can't get no satisfaction. That is one of the most theologically accurate songs. I went back and looked through all the lyrics this week because I knew I wanted to talk about that part. I couldn't remember the rest of what it says. And just as the song goes on, even with all the verses, it's like, yeah, this song really hits, He can't get satisfaction with this. He can't get satisfaction with that. This song's got it. It describes the message that God is bringing through Habakkuk. And it's interesting that, one of the Rolling Stones' most popular songs is basically saying, our lifestyle, the way of the world, it results in no satisfaction. And that is exactly what Habakkuk is saying here. So he's saying, if you go the way of pride, if you go the way of drink, it will end with an unsatisfying life. And one of the ways he brings this out is by saying, your end will be Sheol. That is the realm of the dead, the place where all the dead goes. And he says, what do you know about Sheol? Sheol's never satisfied. Sheol always wants more people to come in and enter his gates in death with new people that die every year, which is a picture of how people are in sin. And that is, this sin is never enough. You will always need more and more and more and more. And what happens when you get more and more sin is it gets worse and worse and worse. It's just like death. It's just like Sheol. That is life of those who reject God. So even in Sheol, the dissatisfaction of those who turn from God and to sin will continue. So, big tablet. And God says, you have option number 1, my people, everybody who reads this. I actually think this is meant to be a message for both the Jews and the invading Babylonians. Everybody should see this. Jew and Babylonian alike. If you want to live for sin, what will be the result of your sin? You will never be satisfied by it. But then God gives another choice on that tablet. Very short phrase, but the righteous will live by his faith. And there's been no small amount of controversy as it relates to the meaning of this little phrase. This is probably one of the more debated phrases in all the Old Testament as far as what it means. There's 2 ways that we could take this phrase. You could, and they're both equally valid according to the Hebrew. If you had this statement all by itself, no context around it, both of these fit with the Hebrew terms that are used. It could be, but the righteous will live by his faith, or it could also be, the righteous will live by his faithfulness. That Hebrew word that's used here both means to believe and to trust in someone, or it means to walk in faithful obedience based upon what you believe. The word means both of those. Context is what determines whether it's trust in someone else or faithfulness in your own behavior. It's the context that determines it. They could both evilly mean that. And I think you need to say that if you are basing this on the larger context of the Old Testament, you should probably take it as faithfulness. Because what do we see throughout the Old Testament? We see the message really beginning with the largest illustration of it in the book of Deuteronomy, with those parallel blessings and cursings. Who is blessed in Deuteronomy? Those who are faithful, those who walk according to the law. Again and again, we see that blessed is the man who does right. Blessed is the one who walks according to the law. That's one of the main messages of the psalm. And so if you look throughout all the Old Testament, it really does make sense. And this is why I think the majority of people say Habakkuk's message is the righteous will live by his faithfulness. They'll walk godly lives, they'll live godly lives, and they'll live based upon their faithfulness. And so God is telling to Habakkuk here, I know you don't understand why I'm using Babylon as an instrument of justice, but you don't need to understand. You need to just continue to be faithful. You need to walk according to the law, and you will live. And almost every Jewish scholar takes that view. I take a different view. I take the other view that I believe we should see this faith as not faithfulness, but as trust or belief in God. So this is not related to Habakkuk's behavior or the behavior of the Jews in his day, but that is by putting their faith and trust in the goodness and the character of God. The righteous will live not because of his own faithfulness to God's law, but because he trusts in God. One reason, I got to be honest, why I like that view is because that's the view the Apostle Paul takes. That's how he interprets this phrase in both Romans 1:17 and in Galatians 3:11. But I don't only take this view because I agree with Paul, but I also take this view because I believe this is Habakkuk's view as well. Because the rest of Habakkuk chapter 2, Habakkuk will give us a song on woe to those who are violent, and woe to those who have a drunken lifestyle, and how it all leads to no satisfaction. And then in chapter 3, Habakkuk has his second song. That second song is based upon the phrase, the righteous will live by faith. If we look at the context of Habakkuk, the way the book's laid out, Habakkuk 3 is based upon the phrase, the righteous will live by faith. And then the question is, when we get to Habakkuk chapter 3, and we'll look at it next week more closely, Habakkuk never in there talks about the obedience of God's people. He never talks about being faithful according to the law at all. There's nothing about the wonders of an obedient lifestyle. There's nothing about repent of your sins in order to receive God's message. Instead, Habakkuk 3 is about one thing. It is a song about the glory of God coming to his people. Habakkuk 3 is an imaginative telling of God coming in power and might to help his people. And then the end of Habakkuk 3 is Habakkuk saying, well, after seeing this vision of God, after meditating on God's glory, I can now say that even when my crops fail, even when all of my animals die, even when I have nothing else, I have Yahweh, and that is enough. I have God, and that's all I need. So I'm going to rejoice in the Lord, and the Lord will be my strength. Now, does that song sound like a song where Habakkuk's saying, I need to be faithful? Or is it a song where Habakkuk is saying, I need to trust in God's power and God's character and God's goodness? It's a song where Habakkuk's saying, I need to trust in who God is. So based upon Habakkuk 3, which I believe is Habakkuk's own interpretation of this phrase, Habakkuk is saying, how will I live through this? I will live through this by putting my faith and trust in God. So Habakkuk comes to God in this book, and Habakkuk says, God, I don't get it. How are you allowing wickedness to go unchecked in my city, in your city, among your chosen people? And then God says, I'm not allowing the wickedness to go unchecked. I'm bringing the Babylonians in judgment. And then Habakkuk responds, that's not fair. This is worse. And God, like any good parent, when their child responds and says, how can we make this decision, Mom and Dad? This is going to make everything worse. I can't eat my vegetables. I can't go to bed on time. Oh, why are you punishing me for what I just did? I couldn't even help it. And then the parent needs to look at their child and say, I know you can't understand this right now, but you need to trust that I love you and that I have your best interest at heart, even if this doesn't make sense. And so Habakkuk chapter, we'll end up seeing in the end of Habakkuk chapter 3, illustrating the phrase, the just will live by faith, this is God saying to Habakkuk, I know you don't get this right now. And I know you can't process why I would send the Babylonians. And God doesn't even bother trying to explain it. God just simply, like a good parent, says, you're just going to need to trust me here. You're just going to need to believe that I have the best for this situation. And those who trust me, those who lean not on their own understanding, but on my understanding, what will happen to those who believe and trust in God? They'll live. They'll live. And so this is a call for us to believe and put our trust in God, even when it doesn't make sense, knowing that God will deliver us in the end.